Look, I did the first Nerd Files episode 4 years ago, and it was so easy to come up with content that would be interesting and compelling. And in time, I feel like I've just discharged so much information, plus all the writing I did years ago. I feel like I've conveyed most of it. And as I've looked back, I realized that, first of all, recycling information maybe isn't that bad. In fact, going over the same information again is a time-tested and proven marketing method and education method. So why not? And second, the stuff that I think I've made clear in the past, maybe it's just clear in my head, or maybe it's not even that clear in my head, but probably isn't that familiar to this audience. So we're going to go right ahead with a Nerd Files episode on kickwaxing, the Untold tricks. I'm trying a new thing now. This is clickbait naming. Untold tricks and tips for kickwaxing, advanced kickwaxing. Untold makes it seem really compelling, right? I have a script. It's an outline. It's kind of long. We'll see how it goes. Many people succeed on their own behalf or in lower level competition with a really simple approach, that is to use one line of wax and just work your way up the line if you need more kick. If extra blue's not working, go to special purple. This works. This is great. This is, in fact, the basis for all kickwaxing. You need to fundamentally understand that you can work your way up a line and have good success. Unless you start there, you really have no business moving on to more advanced methods of trying to look for more advantage. Once you are secure that you're in the ball game, then moving on to more advanced stuff is fine. It's good. So pretty much anytime I put out a video on any sort of kickwaxing, inevitably going to get some comments from people saying, "Whoa, I just used the Swix line and it works great." If it's going to offend you that I'm moving straight past that approach, just turn off the video now, because this is aimed at people who are looking for a little advantage, something that's just a little more than it works. The it works standard is a very helpful standard and one that you need to achieve. You cannot apply these tricks until you have hit the it works standard. That means it glides, it kicks, you're not running around on high heels and you can make it up the hills. That's it works. Now, if you want to do better, here we go. The other note on this is that I'm not going to give specific recipes or examples. I'm not even going to cite specific waxes. These are just a prop to be interesting to look at and to give me something to fidget with. I don't actually have any visual aids prepared. We're going to talk about a bunch of different factors, and we're not going to tell you what waxes to use. Instead, we're going to focus on variables and factors and the qualities of the waxes that we're using. And it's going to be up to waxers to apply it to their own wax box and their repertoire. Okay, big picture, when we talk about kickwaxing, it's really tempting just to focus on the wax. What wax are you using today? Fundamentally, you need to understand that when we're kickwaxing, we're dealing with the confluence of a bunch of different variables. First, we have, of course, the wax, but the wax has to go on a ski, and that ski has different camber characteristics, different flex characteristics. And that ski and wax need to work on different snow types, different crystal types, and different track surfaces, harder, softer, you name it. They need to work on a course, which might have really determinative uphill climb sections where you absolutely have to have kick, or it might be determined much more by your speed on the flats, double poling, or even by some really fast downhill runouts, like a sprint, like the Lake Placid sprint, for example. And finally, we're working with a skier, and different skiers might have different techniques, different styles, and different personal priorities. When we take the course and the skier combined and we say those are variables that you have to tune to the circumstances for the skier, we are still left with the ski, the snow, and the wax as variables isolated from the personal interests of the skier that we need to try to address and work with, and they work in combination. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to examine some of the variables involved here and specifically talk about what type of interplays emerge as we look at these variables. Ski variables. All right, when we look at skis, we're going to try to keep this pretty simple. We could get into really great depth, and I would refer you to a video on YouTube that's like 40 minutes long, where I spent a lot of time looking at pocket shapes and geometries and what the implications are for kicking force and all of that. But when we look at skis, there are a couple things that we need to keep in mind fundamentally right off the bat. The first is camber height. High camber skis tend to have higher absolute kick force contribution because kick comes from a state of change under the ski. So as we compress the ski, we press the wax into the snow. And once the ski is compressed, you can't really change the interface anymore. All you're changing is the local pressure where you've already made a difference, but you're not getting that much more deformation. The way I put it is you need to be able to make some noise under the ski to make kick force. And it's like slamming a door. If you have a door that's mostly already closed, it's really hard to make additional noise by slamming it, whereas if it's wide open, you can make a real racket. So higher camber skis, you can make more noise, you can kick harder. This implies the ability to carry thicker wax jobs, the need to carry thicker wax jobs, the ability to carry and the need to carry stiffer wax or harder wax solutions. But the trade-off is that these are more prone to icing in tricky conditions because that imprint force is so high. You tend to bed the crystals in hard, so you pick up ice much more easily. Also interesting to note that they have more angular force contribution, so that the amount of force that comes kind of in from the outsides of the pocket, where the pocket shape is clearly defined, tend to be quite high compared to a really low flat pocket, which just pushes down. Angular force contribution is this kind of clamping force that is really effective in softer snow. So we're going to want to keep that in mind. On the other side of the equation, we have lower camber skis. Low camber skis are really easy to access. It's easy to put the wax down, but we make low absolute kick force contribution. So typically, with these low camber skis, we have to use more compliant, softer, penetrable waxes and tackier waxes. These low camber skis tend to favor skiers with a lighter and more precise kick trigger, and also tend to be a little less prone to developing icing as the corollary to the note I made on the high camber skis. The other factor in cambers that we need to take into consideration is the pocket shape, the position of the high point under the foot. If you think about the camber as being like a leaf spring, if your foot's right on top, then when you load through it, it compresses down to flat. If, on the other hand, you put the high point out front, when you compress with your foot, there's a section of the pocket that never fully closes. This is an asset for running speed. The amount of surface area contact between the wax and the snow is much lower on skis that have this residual camber because of the high point pushed forward. When that ski stops and you're no longer moving, the snowpack is never totally flat or level, so the loss of kick is not that high, particularly if the snowpack isn't super hard and flat. On a really hard flat track, you tend to want a flatter wax pocket so you have engagement. But on softer or squirrely snow, sometimes that added shape gives you the ability to carry higher kicking wax, like stickier waxes, and keep the speed because that shape is really magical for speed. It also can contribute more kick because it gives you more chance to develop angular kick force. The second thing to consider are wax variables. Now, when we talk about wax, it's really tempting just to spread out a line on the table in front of us and think of it in terms of graduated hardness. There you go. You have hard, a little softer, a bunch softer, and really soft, right? This is how we categorize these waxes in our minds. But there's actually a lot more going on than that. And when we look at different product lines, like between, say, this S series and the M series, or even between the Rex -1, -4 and Rhodey B17, there are really different qualities involved. There are so many materials involved in mixing up kick wax, you can steer things quite a lot. So it's really important for us to understand some of the factors that we're working with here. Of course, we have hardness. That's fundamental. We all understand hardness, but it's not the only variable. But let's talk about it anyway. Softer waxes, they give more kick because they're easier to penetrate. So you get more crystal penetration. The little sharp facets of the crystals tend to push into the wax more easily. They also tend to hold those crystals more strongly because of that added penetration, so they can drag the crystals along and cause icing. So that's a downside. A harder wax is more resistive, also easier to release because the crystals don't get pushed in as far. In terms of speed on the snow, it gets really tricky. Often, softer waxes can be faster because they're more compliant, whereas hard waxes, or I tend to think of them as stiff waxes, tend to kind of bully the snow. They're like dropping a brick in the snow as they run along the snow. They push snow out of the way in a very different way. They're not compliant or yielding enough, and so they can often make the skis feel kind of draggy. A lot of times, a softer wax runs faster. Another factor about wax that is related to hardness but isn't the same thing is the viscosity of the wax. This is a sort of technical term used to describe the internal friction of something. Anything that flows slowly, like say honey or thick motor oil, is characterized by high viscosity. You can have different fluids with different viscosities, and you might think you're only talking about sort of the thickness or the flow, but in ski wax, which has fluid properties, we are talking about internal resistance to movement. So as we have waxes that are more viscous, they are less prone to dragging on the base, and they're more supportive. So they can provide really good depth of kick support when we're talking about looking for dull crystal penetration. But higher viscosity waxes can also be more draggy for the same reason that harder waxes are, that they're not as yielding and they don't flow or yield to bumps on the tracks and instantaneous high pressure interface in the way that softer waxes can. One factor we don't often talk a lot about in kick waxes, but it's really important in binders and some clisters, and to a degree in kick waxes, is elasticity. And as we talk about binders, this does become important. Typically, kick waxes are really characterized by what we'd call plastic deformation. So when you push on it, the wax yields and it doesn't rebound. It just changes its shape. That's plastic deformation. Elastic deformation is when you push and it bounces back, obviously. And that's not something that we really very often associate strongly with kick waxes. But like I said, some of the more aggressive binders or base waxes like Vouti Super Base can have quite a lot of elasticity. They do have some rebound to them, and it's also true of some of the clister materials. It's not high levels of elastic rebound, but some of the elastic response in those materials can make them very supportive, can add a lot of cushion and bite to the kick, but are egregiously so if they come to the surface and interact directly with the crystals, where they almost fight the snow interface. Finally, and this is really important, we have tackiness. These waxes, all of them have ingredients in them that Davide Moseli, this star guy, refers to as glue. And he says, yeah, we have different types of glue. Some glue holds the wax to the ski, like, you would find in these base waxes, like this Vouti GS base. It has glue to hold the wax to the ski, or the Super Base for sure has glue to hold the wax to the ski. But they also need to use ingredients that stick the wax to the snow. And this is a type of glue. I have no idea what it is or where it comes from or why these things are even manufactured in the world, but there are things they can put in to the wax to make it tackier or more adhesive. So the level of tackiness and adhesion is something that you can sort of play with or experiment. If you've seen people do that testing where they get some wax up to room temperature and then they make the little strings, those little strings tend to be indicative of the level of adhesive material. This is one of our M series waxes with a fair amount of clister material in it. So it's got a bunch of little strings. And I think the amount of adhesive material is something that we might not be innately aware of, but it really guides our selection. It's one of the factors that we're paying attention to when we're testing waxes and selecting them. Finally, of course, when we're talking about a wax job, we have to talk about application. So we have this wax and we're putting it on the ski. There's an old saying that I think I first heard from Terry Aldrich when I showed up at Middlebury my freshman year: thick to kick and thin to win. I know you've heard it. Thick to kick and thin to win. It's an old adage, right? You put a wax on thinner and you're going to have faster skis. You put it on thick and you're going to get really good kick. In general, though, we do need to bear in mind that when we are building up thickness in the wax, some waxes do really well in their bulk properties. In other words, they build volume in a supportive way. Those would typically be waxes that are a bit harder and more viscous, more resistant to flow. Other waxes don't do as well when they build thickness. Some of the clister waxes, like the M series waxes here, are quite variable. So as you build thickness, the wax changes. You get more of the clister showing through and the wax becomes less supportive. So I would say they have variable bulk properties. You can use this stuff as a cushion, but you build volume and you have a huge amount of penetrability because of the amount of relatively soft material in them. On the other hand, waxes like the Rhody Topline waxes tend to have really, really good bulk property. They don't change all that much as you build thickness. So understanding the response of the waxes to building thickness, super important as you build your wax jobs. The other factors to consider and topics of conversation when we're talking about application, of course, are the layering of the wax job. Now, when I was a kid, I remember hearing that the rule of thumb is always build up harder layers and then finish with your softer layers. One of the reasons for that is that the hard layers build the volume and reserve the volume. And if you have a ski with a high camber and you need to take up some of that volume to get your wax closer to the snow, let's say you've got one pair of skis and we've picked it for you to be a universal ski for New England. It's got to carry clister, but we also know that you're racing in hard wax conditions sometimes, and now it's just extra blue. Well, you might want to pad some pretty hard, stiff, non-penetrable wax up as a base for your extra blue on that day, so that you don't have too soupy or flowy a mix of extra blue. Maybe a bunch of green or some cold blue underneath to pad that wax up. On the other hand, more often than not, as we get deeper into race waxing for tricky conditions, we're doing the opposite. We're putting a soft wax on, what we would consider a cushion, underneath a wax that is designed to be fast and yield the kick interface that we want directly with the snow. Those cushion waxes provide penetrability for the whole wax job. And underneath that, we might have a binder layer. So typically we think in 3 layers. Binder, or base wax, is the one layer in your kick wax job where you can effectively often find both enhanced kick and enhanced speed. If we just take these two, these are Vouty's famous binders. They're Super Base, which is very elastic and toothy, and they're AT Base, which is just a hard wax base with some Terva in it that really doesn't change the kicking characteristics of the wax at all. In drier, newer snow, the AT Base is definitely faster, and the wax works better if you don't change the suspension characteristics of it. But if the snow is a little old and there's some moisture in the track and it's a little hard to get kick, Super Base can be amazing because it provides several things. It provides vertical compliance or penetrability to the whole wax job. You think of your wax job as a layer on the surface, and underneath it, you've got this cushion or supporting base layer that is penetrable. It provides some elasticity, so it rebounds, it retains its shape and response, and it provides not just vertical compliance and rebound, but horizontal compliance and rebound. This is at least how I envision it in my mind, because it's really what it feels like on the snow, that you get a slightly delayed hookup and then a really enhanced kick force translation. So this Super Base can really spike the range of your kick wax in terms of providing kick assurance. And in the right conditions, it often frequently tests faster than the AT Base. Very often we're right in between and we're working on a continuum. So you have something like the AT Base working faster and not as much kick, and the Super Base providing better kick but running slower. And in those conditions, we often end up mixing different things. So clearly you can cut down the Super Base. Say we might put a little bit of a standard kick wax into the Super Base to soften the toothiness of it and remove some of that elastic response and make it run faster and still be accommodating or, allow penetration. One of the keys to doing really good work in kick waxing is to dedicate some time to base wax testing. We typically run a dedicated test fleet with several different base waxes. Up to 6 products is practical to test on a day, all covered with the same basic kick wax. We'll go out and we'll run those early in the day and figure out what kind of window we're in for kick waxing in terms of the base preparation. And that could be anything from that AT Base to the Super Base to maybe a Rex Orange binder or some of the Swix bases. Even some clister dropped into some of these bases is really frequently quite good. Okay, as we move past wax, we need to talk about the snow. Now, when we're trying to wax, we're trying to come up with a wax job for the ski that it's going on to and for the snow on the course. And snow has a ton of variables that can really play into consideration here in important ways. First, and obviously, the moisture/temperature. The reason we measure snow temperature is to track moisture. And the more free moisture there is, the more kick support you need from your wax. You need to make the wax more penetrable and more supportive and more tacky. So fundamentally, as you work up the temperature scale, you work up the moisture scale, you're working with stickier waxes, which is why they're all based on these temperature profiles. I really wish we'd just get rid of the temperatures on the waxes and you could just understand the material in terms of its material properties and know that they're not absolute. But in relative terms, you can be pretty darn sure that S30, which is yellow and has a high temperature, is going to provide more kick support than the S25, which is red, which has a little bit lower temperature. Same on every single line. You work in sequence up and down the line, and the hardness, the tackiness, the kicking ingredient, the glue, if you will, and the viscosity and everything are engineered to work in sequence. Of course, another major variable in terms of snow is the crystal type and the track surface. This is really important because we see more and more aged snow, man-made snow, old snow. In the olden days when waxes were developed, we were often skiing on really lightly groomed natural snow that hadn't seen a ton of traffic. Back when the Holmenkollen was a 50K loop, or even when it was 225K loops and it was groomed with snowmobiles or light equipment, just didn't see anything like close to the traffic that the modern 8.3 kilometer loop on man-made snow just groomed to death with huge piston bullies and then skied over and over and over again by multiple disciplines. I mean, those tracks are so used that the snow gets really heavily transformed. This is one of the reasons that I think we've moved past some of the great traditional waxes. Extra blue absolutely has its days, but we need to remember that it was developed at the dawn of time when a lot of the very common race conditions that we face in a snowmaking era on short loops with really heavy grooming equipment were just very, very different. Obviously, the older, the duller, the more heavily worked snow and the coarser snow requires softer, more penetrable waxes with more kick support. Track surface is also super important. Hard tracks can be really supportive and can support a harder wax job because you can kick against them harder, so it's easier to get that imprint force. They can be really favorable for skiers who develop force rapidly and kick really hard, and it can really inform the ski choice. So some skiers in those days can carry super, super high skis. Ida Sargent, for example, was one of the smaller women on the U.S. ski team when she was skiing there, but she skied some of the stiffest skis and loved hard track conditions, like in Kuusamo. Early season was always kind of bomber in that big final hill. Ida had some of her best World Cup races ever there, and I know she was on some pretty high, punchy skis because they were so fast, and she could make those work really well, whereas Sophie, skiing in the same races, required lower skis and maybe a little more accessible wax job. Another kind of tricky intermediate condition we get with snow really often is what we refer to as plastic snow. Remember how I mentioned the plastic deformation characteristics of wax? When you push on it and it doesn't rebound, that's plastic deformation. Well, you see that really often with snow. We call it snowball snow. It's packing snow. Snow that when you pack it, it doesn't flow, it packs. It packs into a solid. So kind of, you never see elastic snow, but you do see viscous flow underfoot. So if the snow kind of deforms like sand, like dry sand on a beach, you're experiencing more viscous flow. If it's just churning around, maybe it's even hard tracks, but the snow kind of churns and gets a little sugary. That's not plastic snow, but snow that packs is quite plastic. And that is tricky because typically you're talking about some moisture involvement and glazing tracks. Glazing tracks almost always produce really slow gliding skis if you build the thickness of the wax up too much, regardless of the height of the camber. So often we end up having to go with a low camber ski in order to have kick accessibility with a very thin wax job and end up also on tackier waxes. So for instance, this M26 we've used often in plastic snow conditions, glazing tricky tracks where the track gets kind of squirrely and there's moisture, some glaze, and we had to have it on a really, really low ski and keep it quite thin in order to have the speed and the tackiness to be able to attack the track. And of course, the other track condition is that condition that features viscous flow. But to the extreme, we can think about sugary granular snow that is quite deep and churny. Some of the classic viscous flow conditions are like when there's falling sleet or snow that's seen repeated rain and freeze cycles. There was one year at U.S. Nationals in Rumford where all season long we had snowfall followed by heavy rain, followed by a deep freeze and more snowfall. And it was just like this bottomless sleet pile. It wasn't actually sleet. It was just transformed snow, and it kept refreezing so hard that there wasn't a lot of available moisture for it to pack down, and it just churned into this loose snow. When we get into those churny, loose snow conditions, we need a quite high ski because those high skis have that angular force contribution, which gathers and collects the snow and keeps it from shearing. When you have a lot of viscous flow underfoot, the snow tends to shear away because it doesn't stick to itself very well. And so you need to find different ways to support the kick. And high skis or skis with high residual camber can be really good in those conditions. Curiously, we can also sometimes get away with quite hard waxes in those conditions. We've had some of the best success ever, that U.S. Nationals in Rumford, for example, where we put on a pretty thick binder pad. At the time, I think it was the Rex Orange binder we were using with the Hardwax solution on top, when the instinctive thing looking at the crystals is to use Clister. But because the skis can provide so much of that gathering force, and because the penetration required isn't necessarily that deep, you can get really good results out of the Hardwax solutions in those conditions. I'm sure you can identify more variables or factors that need to be taken into consideration, but I'm trying to boil this down to a presentation that will not bore everyone to death and won't run too long. I've made this little list of tips, tricks, and hacks because I promised all these untold secrets. So the big one for me, and the one that's really defined a lot of my work, is that softer waxes are often faster than harder waxes. Years ago, I identified what I called a bimodal distribution in kick wax, where sometimes in quite cold conditions, you find there's good kick and a bunch of green waxes. And then as you move up to the blues, the kick kind of goes away. They don't even work that well. And the speed really suffers because they're too stiff. But then you get into some of the violets, and all of a sudden the kick goes way high and the speed actually comes back, and they're very competitive. I remember putting Chris Freeman out in a Super Tour mass start 30K in a blizzard at 2 degrees Fahrenheit on Rody Topline VO, which is like a cold violet, which is so far out of range, but the skis were really fast. It was a low 902, so it was this high point was forward. It had enough shape in the pocket to carry, and it was just dumping down snow, so it was really hard to ski off the front, but the skis gave good enough kick that on the uphills, and because he was quite strong, he was able to ski off the front of a mass start in a blizzard because he had a different level of kick from everybody else in the race. And that's one of those circumstances where you get that second peak in the kick wax performance in a much softer wax. Often that's not really the case, but very frequently we see these soft waxes have a really glassy, great feel, but suffer from icing concerns. So if you're looking on the soft end of things, very frequently, if it feels like it's getting slower, it's because the softness is just wrong, or it's dragging and carrying snow along. So you need to find something that releases the snow and allows for good glide. And you need to couple it with a ski that has enough shape in the pocket, minimizes the surface area during gliding. So we're talking about more of a, say, in the Fisher world, a low 902 ski instead of one of the old 812s, or even maybe one of the new 702 skis. Okay, another factor to keep in mind, and this isn't really a secret, it's just an observation. The best solution on a day is always a combination of ski, wax, and skier. I'm going to tell a short story about Sophie Caldwell at the Sochi Olympics, where she had a 6th place in the sprint after getting taken out in the final. She was going to win that thing, I know it. But she got crashed out in the final. But there was some illness in the team, and several days later, she was given the opportunity to race the 10K Classic, which wasn't on her program at all, but heck, that sounded like fun. The problem is that on the way to Sochi, when we were loading the van in Munich, her waxer had gone ahead. Oleg had left, and so there was no one who was directly responsible for putting her ski bags into the transport for the airport. And probably it should have been me because I'm her removed cousin, but I didn't do it. And so Sophie got to Sochi and didn't have any classic skis. So she had her skate skis. That was good because it was a skate sprint, but there was no classic skis for her. So I went to Fisher and I took 2 pairs of classic skis for the conditions. We took one traditional high clister ski and one very, very soft low clister ski with a lot of shape. Well, in the days after the sprint, Oleg was super involved because he was the head of Kik in testing Kik and working for other athletes. He had other athletes he was directly responsible for, and Sophie wasn't a priority. So I said I would help Sophie for training. And we tested those 2 pairs of skis every day for several days. And the thing is this, those low skis, because they're so low, can't carry a high volume of kick wax. So we couldn't use a solution that relied on high absolute kick force, deep crystal penetration, and a lot of support. That's the traditional stiffer clister job that had to go onto the high skis. On the low skis, we were using super tacky, very, very thin wax. And for several days, we just kept liking that super tacky, very thin wax. Well, when it came to the race day, the wax job that the team chose was a more traditional wax job, and it was a very good wax job. They nailed it. It was a great wax job for the day, but it was really built around the higher skis. So when Sophie tested her skis, it was really clear that her high skis were much better on that wax job. Oleg had prepared both pairs, but he did it with the same wax, and maybe even made the low skis a little harder, thinking that he was making them a little faster because they were low. Well, she really didn't like the feel of those, but I ended up taking the wax off and putting on a super thin layer of just something that's very soft. I think it was Skigo HF Yellow that just happened to be on the table, or one layer of really thin wax. And I slid it over to Soph, just one of the skis. And she was like, yeah, that's the feeling I remember. And she loved that because she didn't have to kick hard. Really long hills, she could push her foot, just grab a little bit. But as soon as she was back on the ski, that it would release and run really, really well with this thin layer of very, very tacky wax. And she had a great race. I don't think it was a career result for her, but for where she was in her career and in a distance race on a championship course like they had in Sochi, she had a really good result on these super low skis that we had grabbed in deep slushy snow. Some of my other tips and tricks involve stuff that I've already explicitly mentioned here about pocket shape and cushion and everything else. I'm not even going to talk about speed covers and all of that stuff because it's basic. So you already know that in some conditions you can take a really fast wax, like this S10 was basically designed to be one, and put a really thin layer on to take some of the tooth off of the wax, and you'd call it a speed cover, and it goes really fast. Not that interesting. So the main thing that I want to talk about now is retaining ski shape and this interplay between the camber of the ski and the wax job. When I first started measuring skis, we were mapping them out and kind of describing the camber in zones. So here's your 0.1 millimeter mark. That's 2 layers of wax. And here's your 1500ths and your 2/10ths and your 3/10ths and your 5/10ths. And you can layer the wax and pyramid it up because you've got all this space under the camber. Well, that presupposes that you want to take a shaped ski and fill it up so that it's just dead flat. When you have that flat interface, you have 1-for-1 contact between the kick wax and the snow when you're gliding. Because don't think for a second that the kick wax isn't touching the snow. It is. It might not be pressured, but it's in contact, so it's dragging. So when you fill the whole shape of the pocket up with wax, you're definitely creating more surface area contact, and the ski will slow down. We tend to pick the skis these days. The skis that we sell, we intend to support really simple wax jobs. So what we want is for you to be able to put on binder and 4 layers of wax and not modify the shape. We tell people just to wax the pocket as marked, and we put a mark in the front and a mark in the back, and that's it. That's the kick wax marking now, and that's how we work with our top-level race skis as well, because we want to retain the shape. Now, along the lines of that, traditionally, you would build added cushion if you need it underneath the high point of the camber. But a lot of times, when the high point is not a place where there's going to be a lot of pressure on the ski, let's say the high point is in front of the foot, and we know that once the ski is bottomed out under the load, that high point isn't going to put more pressure on. What we've started doing is to put the cushion where there's action in the pocket during some of those angular force contribution zones. This is something I picked up from Joachim Augustin, who was with the U.S. ski team and was Chris's waxer for a few years, and absolutely one of the best kick waxers I've ever seen. He went on to return to the Swedish team and was responsible for the skis that Johan Olsen used to win the 2013 50K in a solo breakaway. And I went to see him afterwards, and guess what? Those were really low camber skis. Super cool story. An amazing race. If you are unaware of that race, go back, look it up on YouTube. He left the field early in the race got away with Dario Colonia. Colonia crashed, and then he was alone, and he skied solo off the front of the pack for the win. Unbelievable day. I'm so happy to have witnessed it. What was I saying? Oh, yeah. Joachim is the one. No, maybe it was Oleg. One of those guys was cushioning the wax on the outsides. No, it might have been Larry Porama. That's William Porama's dad. I learned so much in these various trips with these foreign waxers that have been on the World Cup for years and worked with different teams. But supporting the kick where you need it, the contribution of kick from the outside in, you tend to express the pocket from the outside in. And specifically, if you need kick early, you need to cushion under the foot, which is as you roll into the pocket where you get your first real contribution of grip. And as you roll through the kick motion and you move past the ski, the front of the pocket where you get a little angular force contribution becomes really, really important. So cushioning the front of the pocket becomes critical. If we fill up the middle of the pocket where the high point is, we're stealing speed and we're not really getting early contribution and we're not really getting late contribution. We're just deepening the kick that we get at the hardest pressure when we're vertically loaded. And that's usually not where we need the support. So sometimes waxing the ends of the pocket for added kick yields both better speed and better kick support. And the other tricky thing is when you get a solid to solid interface, let's say you have a ski on a glazed hard track, you experience some of the same factors that are really concerned with glide zones and structure, hand structure or grinds. The whole reason we put grind patterns on skis is to make them run faster when you get that solid interface. Put some air in the system is what Lars Svensson likes to say. So we're just trying to interrupt the kind of surface tension, the adhesion, cohesion that can interrupt things. And I've said over and over again that more surface area contact will slow down skis in your kick job. So another trick that I saw these guys do and have used myself is when you see these conditions and you feel the kick wax dragging, you can take your cork and put undulations in your kick wax job, or even just make it purposely messy, screw it up a little bit so it's not glassy smooth. Glassy smooth gives you more surface area engagement, more predictable surface area engagement, and enhances the kick. It also smooths out the high points. If you have dropping big globs of wax into the snow, that's not going to be good. But if you purposely create undulations or roughness in the surface of the wax to introduce ways to break up that surface to surface, the solid contact between your wax job and the snow surface, you can make it way, way faster. Another interesting thing to keep in mind. Okay, those are some of my tips and tricks, some of the lessons that I've learned that are a little bit counterintuitive. A lot of people, it breaks their brain when I first say, oh yeah, lower skis need softer wax and higher skis need harder wax. Because normally, wouldn't you think that higher skis need more kick and lower skis need less kick? Well, yeah, that's true, but you're going to do it in volume and support in the wax job. So these things often don't follow on the initial logic that starts with the hard, softer, softest way of thinking. Finally, you need to learn your materials. You need to learn the characteristics of the waxes. In time, as I've worked closer with Davide Moseli on formulating waxes and tried to understand how he works with ingredients to change the characteristics, I've learned that there is more than just hardness, that we can change the amount of adhesive material or glue. We can change the viscosity. We can steer the characteristics of these waxes in different ways. And that's trained me and taught me to look for those characteristics in other waxes. And that's helped a huge amount. So becoming a student of the waxes and trying to understand when a B17 is better than a -1, -4, it's really helpful. They're not equivalent. They're quite different. How does extra blue fit in? I mean, these things all have their own characteristics and you need to try them against each other rather than just pick your favorite on one day and then consider it settled science, because it's not. Every time you try something new, you're going to figure out that your assumption from last time was wrong. So that's it. What tips and tricks do you have? I'm sure all of you could teach me as much as anything else. Just please don't tell me just to pick one line and work up it, and otherwise I'm just dumb, because that's not what we're talking about here. I'd really be curious, though, if you can tell me something that I don't know, because that'll make it a good day.